Celebrating the best years of 2018, it's the Yearies! Hey y'all, Scott here, and welcome to the Yearies, the annual yearly Year of the Year awards that awards the finest in years this past year. Before we get to Year of the Year for 2018, let's take a moment to reflect on the years we've lost over the years. Yeah, this might take a while. Yeah, looks like we got about 6 hours to kill while that video plays. The problem is, after preparing for the Yearies so much, the only two things I'm good at discussing right now are years and games. So I just gotta come up with some year-based video game topics. Oh! Games and years. Can't have one without the other, and plus, those two words are on my top 3 favorite concepts list, the third word being Jeff Keighley.
Here to present Game of the Year, Jeff Keighley.
It's as inevitable as this sentence having 27 words in it. Game of the Year is something that every entertainment publication squirts out each and every December. Of course, you get the side awards like Best Art Direction, Best PlayStation 4 Game, most likely to get shot in an Amish village, but Game of the Year is the one award that gets everybody's attention. Now, this term doesn't have much value to it in my opinion. With other entertainment mediums like movies, the Academy Award for Best Picture is generally regarded as the most prestigious award a film can receive. Doesn't always mean the film's that great or entertaining, but still, it's definitely the cream of the crop in terms of film awards. Games don't really have that. Sure, the Game Awards is trying their hardest, but the phrase Game of the Year is thrown around so much, especially on re-releases of games. After a game's run its course and all the downloadable content and updates are out for it, sometimes a Game of the Year edition is released with everything all on one disc. You see, that's all fine and good, but a lot of games that were never awarded Game of the Year still call the re-release the Game of the Year edition. For example, Dead Island Game of the Year edition. Really? While many actively look forward to the announcement of Game of the Year from all the large gaming publications or award ceremonies, tons of people take a moment to reflect on their personal gaming experiences over the past year, asking, hey, what was the best video game I played? Not me though, that's really something I think about. I don't make it a crazy big priority to immediately play a game in its release year, so when Game of the Year season comes rolling around, I don't normally pick one. I don't know, I just play a lot of games a year or so after their release, so the games I've played this year list generally looks pretty out there. I played BioShock Infinite a year after it released. I played The Last of Us 2 years after it released. I played Nintendo Labo of the year it released. You see why I don't immediately pick a Game of the Year? So why not make up for the past 18 years of not having a personal Game of the Year by going through some of my favorite sequences of 4 numbers and seeing what games were generally nominated for Game of the Year from the big fat publications and what game I would personally pick, even if it wasn't generally nominated for Game of the Year. The general Game of the Year nominations for each year I'll be showing are just what I perceived as the general Game of the Year nominees, kind of the average ones the Game Awards and the big online gaming websites nominated, but what I pick as my Game of the Year will be solely based on what I played. And hey, why not? We'll go all the way back to 2001. Yeah, we're only covering my post-fetus era. My pre-fetus era can wait another day. Now please keep in mind, when I say a certain game is my Game of the Year, it is solely based on my opinion, and it could be for a variety of different reasons. Which game was the most fun, which game was the most impressive, which game was the most groundbreaking. It really changes from year to year what constitutes as a Game of the Year for me. And also, there's a reason why these posters are plastered around the neighborhood. Please don't take me seriously. 2018 was a big fat whatever year for me. As a self-proclaimed publisher of Donkey Konga 2 enthusiast, this was a pretty weak year in terms of Nintendo offerings. Thankfully though, Sony picked up the slack, and at the end of the year, Microsoft said, we could release games this year. Generally, Game of the Year nominees were God of War, Red Dead Redemption 2, Spider-Man, Celeste, and Monster Hunter World. I only played God of War and Celeste out of these, and it's really great that Celeste got some recognition. I mean, it's a sprite-based, hard-as-nails 2D indie platformer, so to see it competing for the same award as some of the largest entertainment productions of all time was pretty nice to see. God of War has been a pretty solid time. I haven't beaten it yet, but the storytelling and presentation are on another level, and it actually has gameplay. So far, it doesn't seem like the deepest thing out there, but nothing's more fun than throwing your axe and begging for it to come back home. Like I said, God of War has gameplay, which is something Red Dead 2 apparently doesn't have. Alright, Red Dead 2 does look freaky solid, but from what I've heard, it seems to prioritize realism and story compared to just being a straight up fun game. I do own it, just haven't popped it in yet. I heard it has a pretty slow start, but the people who stuck with it seem to greatly enjoy it. Solid production overall, it just seems that many preferred the first one. Spider-Man and Monster Hunter World were admirable contenders, but let's be honest, they definitely didn't stand too much of a chance in comparison to the others. Tetris Effect was one I saw on a few Game of the Year lists, and this game deserves 3 oofs in a row. This is a crazy experience, especially in VR. Doesn't help the fact that it's still Tetris, so it's kinda hard to warrant this being a Game of the Year. Shadow of the Colossus was also pretty banging, however it was a remake, so if there was a 2005 Game of the Year award in the 2018 Game Awards, it definitely would have cleaned house in that category. But what about Smash Bros. Ultimate? Why wasn't that game nominated for Game of the Year that much? Well, Ultimate came out a little too late in the year to be eligible for a ton of awards. They're just gonna keep on making the deadline earlier and earlier. Can't wait for the 2030 Game of the Year to be announced on March 2nd, 2030. Also, while Ultimate's a great time, its focus on old content makes it hard to warrant winning Game of the Year. My Game of the Year was probably Smash Bros. Ultimate. Breath of the Wild. Okay, let's be fair here. 2017 was one of those magical years in gaming, where multiple companies pumped out genre-defining title after genre-defining title, all within the same year. General nominees were The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, Super Mario Odyssey, Horizon Zero Dawn, Persona 5, and PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. That's dumb. The Game Awards, the DICE Awards, South by Southwest Game Awards, and countless others nominated PUBG for Game of the Year. This isn't Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, this is 2017. I think it was kinda stupid that PUBG was nominated before it was even officially released. It was in early access, a public beta for the majority of the year, and it was really only nominated not due to its overall quality, but mainly just because it was the new multiplayer craze. Persona 5 was a huge game, but it didn't have the same general audience appeal that Mario Odyssey, Breath of the Wild, and Horizon all had. Horizon Zero Dawn was a beautiful, vast, open-world game that sorta had strengths and departments that Breath of the Wild had weaknesses in. For example, the story. However, Breath of the Wild completely redefined the open world experience and got people who didn't play a ton of Zelda games like myself to fully beat one for the first time. I'm definitely more of a Mario fan, and while Super Mario Odyssey was an absolute blast and a fantastic game, it didn't really shake the world as much as Breath of the Wild did. It was mainly an excellent new 3D Mario game that showed off tons of creativity, while Breath of the Wild was just a bit more. That wasn't all for 2017. Nier Automata, Cuphead, Neo, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Hellblade, Wolfenstein 2, Assassin's Creed Origins, Resident Evil 7, Sonic Mania, effing Puyo Puyo Tetris. It's obvious 2017 was a huge year, but if I had to pick a Game of the Year, it has to be Breath of the Wild. Oh god. 2016 was one of my favorite garbage years in gaming. Just nothing really stuck with me this year, and the general nominations were all over the place. Most major publications had all different kinds of games running for the big one. Doom, Uncharted 4, Overwatch, Inside, The Witness, XCOM 2, Titanfall 2. These were the major ones. I played Doom and Uncharted 4, both pretty solid games. Doom was a fun blast of testosterone, and Uncharted 4 was a nice conclusion to Nathan Drake's story. A far too long nice conclusion to Nathan Drake's story, but still, a nice conclusion to Nathan Drake's story. Honestly though, my 3 favorite games were probably Ratchet & Clank, Kirby Planet Robobot, and Pac-Man Championship Edition 2. I'd probably say Ratchet & Clank was my Game of the Year. That game was just plain straight up fun. Right after I beat it all over again. Uncharted 4 was probably more impressive overall, but nowhere near as fun. Just replaying an hour of it, I was squirming in my seat ready to stop playing. Like, I really enjoyed my time with the game, but I already played it once. It's not something I want to play again. I loved Pac-Man Championship Edition 2, but it was definitely a game that had to grow on ya. At first it seemed like a less interesting, weirder version of Pac-Man Championship Edition DX, but over time I grew to love it. Kirby Planet Robobot was just an excellent Kirby game, definitely my favorite of all time, but I'm still giving it to Ratchet & Clank. 2015 was a better 2016, and all I had to do was change a number. The Witcher 3, Metal Gear Solid 5, Fallout 4, Bloodborne, Rise of the Tomb Raider, Super Mario Maker, and for me it's really between the last two, Rise of the Tomb Raider and Super Mario Maker. I didn't play any of the other games, and Jesus Christ, saying this made me realize sometimes how few of the biggest games each year I play. Anyways, Super Mario Maker was this magical experience that I always dreamed of as a kid, being able to make your own Mario levels. It was truly one of my most anticipated games of the year. My Game of the Year was probably Rise of the Tomb Raider. Yeah, Mario Maker didn't disappoint me, I just didn't get as into it as many others. Still really love it, I just wasn't as crazy about it as I thought I'd be. I think I'm just not as ecstatic about making my own levels as I was as a kid. Rise of the Tomb Raider, while I prefer its predecessor, was a great time, all because it gave me more of that sweet, sweet Tomb Raider reboot gameplay. It's like if Uncharted was more of a game, and I don't mean that as a jab to Uncharted. Tomb Raider simply has more game to it, while Uncharted is a better cinematic experience. Overall, 2015 didn't have a ton of heavy hitters for me overall, probably because 2014 was jam-packed with them.
What's the recipe for surprising the kids, treating yourself, and ditching dish duty? You're looking at it. Order your Pizza Hut faves like Original Pan, Original Stuffed Crust, and more at pizzahut.com. No one out-pizzas the Hut.
Wait a minute. Pizza Hut stuffed crust is the crust that made crust good. Topped and stuffed with over a half-pound of cheese. What are you so afraid of? Loving it? Original stuffed crust, just $12.99. Only from Pizza Hut. No one out-pizzas the Hut.
This will definitely go down in infamy as one of the hardest years for me to pick a game of the year. Start updating those textbooks, McGraw. Seriously, there really wasn't like one game to overpower everything. Some fantastic games released this year, but no game that was undoubtedly the best one. Definitely a lot of wiggle room for discussion. Nominees were generally Super Smash Bros. For Wii U, Bayonetta 2, Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor, Shovel Knight, Dragon Age Inquisition, and Hearthstone. Outside of those games, man, I adored Infamous Second Son, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, Mario Kart 8, even Tomodachi Life. So many fun, great games this year. Shovel Knight was sort of the indie surprise to see on a few major Game of the Year lists, and hey, I really enjoyed Shovel Knight, but I wouldn't consider it one of my all-time favorites. Still a phenomenal game though. The Game of the Year for many publications ended up being none other than Dragon Age Inquisition. Nobody talks about this game anymore. I'm sure it's a great game and all, but this just never felt like, ooh, the best game of the year. It's like most were like, we don't want to give the award to a game with the subtitle for Wii U. That just looked tacky. At the end of the day though, I'm a tacky man who very much enjoyed Super Smash Bros. For 3DS and Wii U. These were the games 2014 was building up to for me, and honestly, they really didn't disappoint me at the time. In retrospect, I can nitpick these games to death, but overall, they were still probably my games of the year. Now this was what you called a year, and finally, Game of the Year nominations I actually all played. BioShock Infinite, The Last of Us, Grand Theft Auto 5, Super Mario 3D World, A Link Between Worlds, Tomb Raider. I played through all of these, and in terms of Game of the Year nominees I didn't play, there was Gone Home and Dota 2. People think I hate Super Mario 3D World because I talked about hating it before. Actually, I think it's a perfectly fine and fun game, just nothing that interesting or exciting, and that's my main problem with it. It doesn't really do too much more than the bare minimum for a 3D Mario co-op game. A Link Between Worlds is a similar situation. This is a great Zelda game, but it's pretty much just another Link to the Past. I mean, it'd be weird if it wasn't. It is the sequel, and it does have a lot of its own ideas, and they're all great. The whole wall merging mechanic and item renting spiel is all genius, I love it. But it's still pretty derivative of Link to the Past, so nothing mind-blowing, just another great classic Zelda game. The big three that really fought it out this year, though, were BioShock Infinite, The Last of Us, and Grand Theft Auto 5. Sorry, Tomb Raider, you were great, I love you, but any and all characters in this game besides Lara Croft were effing bogus, and it was basically just a multi-platform Uncharted. Not that that's a bad thing, Rise of the Tomb Raider was my 2015 Game of the Year, I'm just saying, there's a lot more competition this year. The Last of Us was a phenomenal experience that I never want to have again. You see, I love a lot of PlayStation exclusives, but most of them are kinda just one and dones for me, you know? Like, I enjoyed going through all the Uncharted games, The Last of Us, Infamous Second Son, and most recently God of War, but I do not see myself wanting to replay them, especially The Last of Us. Now, my opinion slightly changed on BioShock Infinite over time. I enjoyed what I played back in the day, but all I remember was the game feeling pretty repetitive after everything was said and done. Story sequence, fight this mob. Story sequence, fight this mob. Story sequence, over and over and over again. So I always said, yeah, it was alright, but felt pretty monotonous after a while. However, I did recently replay a bit of it after what have have I been doing the past 5 years? Oh yeah, got older, and I'm able to appreciate the world of Bioshock Infinite a lot more. Still, I'd probably say The Last of Us would beat it though. Its story is really compelling, yet incredibly easy for anybody to understand. Like, I can summarize this game in a quick paragraph and you could still tell it was a great story. You'd still want to see it played out. Bioshock Infinite, I'd be explaining the story for 30 minutes, waving my arms around, and even I would have a hard time comprehending the plot. It's not a bad story by any means, I just think comparatively, The Last of Us does a better job delivering a story anybody can become attached to and understand. Grand Theft Auto 5 wins. I'm sorry, but Grand Theft Auto 5 is fun, has a decent story, is infinitely replayable, and technically impressive. Oh, it was a year before 2013? Gotta be honest here, 2012 was a pretty boring year for gaming as a whole. Sure, my favorite worst Nintendo console out there released alongside a new Mario game, but the only thing New Super Mario Bros. U will ever be known for was being a new Mario game. Seriously, what even released in 2012? Mass Effect 3? NBA 2K13? While looking at general Game of the Year nominees, they were The Walking Dead, Dishonored, Journey, Fez, Halo 4, holy I never played any of these, and there wasn't a ton of other amazing games that came out that I played. Like, what are my options? Like, New Super Mario Bros. 2 and Sticker Star? I would have played Kid Icarus Uprising, but when I bought it on Amazon, they sent me the European version. I couldn't play it, so I still haven't played this game. But, oh yeah, never mind, apparently Gravity Rush came out in 2012. I love Gravity Rush! I played through it for the first time in 2017, and on the first playthrough, I enjoyed it. The second playthrough, I really enjoyed it. The third playthrough, I kinda realized this is a great game. I love so much about it, especially the art style. The look of buildings in the distance being rough outlines really sells the whole comic book thing they're going for. I love Cat, I love the world. It's just such a fun game that took some time for me to truly embrace, but there's no going back now. Please play this if you haven't. Please. 2011 is what us in the year industry considered to be one of the thicker years in gaming. So much stuff came out, and a lot of it was crazy high quality. Batman Arkham City, Skyward Sword, Uncharted 3, Portal 2, Skyrim. I've dabbled in all of these games, but Uncharted 3 was the one I saw through till the very end, and it is not my game of the year. I liked Uncharted 3, but it just felt like more of Uncharted 2, but not as impressive as Uncharted 2 was when it released. So that leaves us with games I personally loved a ton from this year. Super Mario 3D Land gave some much needed worth to the 3DS, and while it's not the greatest Mario game out there, the level design was so good for handheld play, and it made those darn dang 2 characters in the 3DS's name worth something. But Sonic Generations, oh my god, this was such an amazing game back in the day, and it's still a great time. I'd argue 3D Modern Sonic was topped with this game, and the 2D sections featuring both modern and classic Sonic weren't too bad, albeit they were the worst parts of the stages. Bulletstorm was a fan favorite, and it was just a straight up fun shooter. Rayman Origins is a great game, and I do dig some LA Noire. But honestly, out of all the games I played in 2011, I probably enjoyed Sonic Generations the most. Mario 3D Land is definitely up there. I played a ton of this game back then, but Generations basically made me want an Xbox 360 more so than ever before. And wouldn't you know, I got one that year. Red Dead Redemption, God of War 3, Halo Reach, Mass Effect 2, Super Mario Galaxy 2, all these Game of the Year nominees, but no GoldenEye 007 on Wii. I love the GoldenEye remake, yeah, I said it. It was the best first-person shooter on the Wii, no doubt, and the multiplayer was a little thing us GoldenEye Wii fans call fun. Red Dead Redemption is some great stuff, just like Grand Theft Auto in a debatably much more interesting time period and environment. And Donkey Kong Country Returns was a great comeback for the series. On 3DS, because the motion controls in the original Wii version make me but I'd feel a little weird if I didn't pick Mario Galaxy 2, the sequel to my favorite game of all time, Pac-Man Championship Edition DX. This game was phenomenal, it was everything I wanted in a modern Pac-Man game. This is my 2010 Game of the Year, I only have a little shame. 2009, we got Batman Arkham Asylum, Assassin's Creed 2, Left 4 Dead 2, Uncharted 2, remember when Call of Duty games got nominated for Game of the Year? Well, finally, we have Uncharted 2. Definitely my favorite of the Uncharted series. I think I like Punch-Out on Wii more. God, now this is what you call a retro revival. But we can't forget Wii Sports Resort. Say what you will, but this is such a fun game. But honestly, even when I think I had more fun with that and Punch-Out, I'm giving my Game of the Year to Uncharted 2. It really nailed not only being a good game, but a huge cinematic experience as well. Punch-Out was mainly just a blast from the past, and Wii Sports Resort had canoeing, oh god. It's Brawl. I'm picking Brawl. General nominees were Grand Theft Auto 4, Fallout 3, Gears of War 2, Metal Gear Solid 4, I'm still picking Brawl. To be fair, I've had my fair share of fun with Grand Theft Auto 4, and Burnout Paradise came out this year, and that game's phenomenal, but I'm still picking Brawl.
is the only place Hollywood icons would send their kids to work.
Dude, are you kidding me?
This January,
Today, breeding season.
Nope, I will not be doing that.
8 celebrity kids,
These are the shoes I was telling you about. The Prada ones? They're perfect for the ranch, right?
famous parents,
My dad is Shaquille O'Neal.
Your dad is like worldwide.
0 life skills.
I don't touch sheep. I don't ride horses.
Oh my God, what are you doing?
Giddy up for relatively famous Ranch Rules. New series, January 12th, only on E!
Hit Super Mario Galaxy. BioShock, Halo 3, Mass Effect, Call of Duty 4, Uncharted, The Orange Box. My God, 2007 was an incredible year. And that's just getting started. Stuff like Metroid Prime 3, Crysis, God of War 2. Oh my God. It may seem like it was pretty easy for me to pick my game of the year, and it was, but Mario Galaxy had some steep competition here. I mean, the Orange Box is like, what, 12 games in one or something? And it included Portal, one of the most creative and innovative games of the 21st century. And not only that, but Team Fortress 2 was also included as one of the 17 games in the Orange Box. Metroid Prime 3 showcased how well pointer functionality could work for Wii shooters. Crysis was a giant scheme to force you to buy $1 million computer to run it properly at the time, but hey, it looked nice. Plus, of course, Half-Life 2 episodes packed in as part of the 23 games in the Orange Box. But I'm the simplest of men, and if it ain't in brown shoes walking around planets, it ain't winning Game of the Year. 2006, home to such classics as Oblivion, Okami, Gears of War, Twilight Princess, New Super Mario Bros., but I don't care, because I'm saying my Game of the Year is Wii Sports. Don't worry, I have a doctor's appointment to get these opinions fixed. Wii Sports was the game with the most impact this year, and is easily the game that brought me the most joy. Trying it out for the first time, feeling absolutely dumbfounded that they put me in a video game, constantly playing it with friends and family, ripping it out at parties, and it's still fun to this day. My pick is Wii Sports. Of course, the big battle this year was between Okami and Twilight Princess to see which was the better Zelda game, and Gears of War finally brought the 360 a huge exclusive, but Wii Sports, guys. It's about time we had another oddball year. 2005 wasn't the biggest, really. Surely some solid titles came out, but overall not as impactful as something like 2007. Resident Evil 4 is definitely the big one of the bunch. This is an all-time classic, and alongside it we have God of War, Fear, Call of Duty 2, and Shadow of the Colossus. And I'd say Shadow is my go-to game of the year. I have yet to play Resident Evil 4, so I'm going with this guy. This game is like if Punch-Out was open world. You run around and you beat bosses. That's amazing. One oddball year in the form of 2005 ain't enough to take down 2004. Half-Life 2, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Halo 2, Burnout 3, Metal Gear Solid 3, and on top of that, games like Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, Metroid Prime 2, Pikmin 2. Oh my God, this is what you call a good year for games. But San Andreas is my all-time favorite Grand Theft Auto. I gotta go with that. I love me some Pikmin and Burnout, but come on, you can do this in San Andreas. I don't know, the oddball year returns considering Madden 04 won Game of the Year at the VGAs. It's weird because The Wind Waker came out this year in North America, but it came out in Japan in December 2002, so really, what year is it eligible for? Well, let's go with this one. 2003 nominees generally were Wind Waker, SSX 3, Tony Hawk's Underground, and I will be completely honest, none of these outside of Wind Waker really speak to me. But I will let my childhood reign supreme and say either my Game of the Year is The Simpsons Hit and Run or SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom. I have to go with Battle for Bikini Bottom. I picked this game over Wind Waker, Christ. Grand Theft Auto Vice City, Super Mario Sunshine, Metroid Prime, Morrowind, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4, Kingdom Hearts. Those 365 days were definitely filled up with quality games, which is weird because 2002 never really jumps out to me as a huge gaming year. It even had stuff like Eternal Darkness, but I think you guys know where my priorities lie. It's going to Super Mario Sunshine. I played my fair share of Metroid Prime over the years, but never fully beat it, which just won't stop hurting me. I've been able to see how phenomenal this game is, but I've gotta go with Sunshine, simply because I've played more of it. It's about time. With the launch of the GameCube and Xbox came some heavy hitters like Smash Bros. Melee and Halo, with Grand Theft Auto 3, Metal Gear Solid 2 and Ico on the PlayStation 2, and Conker's Bad Fur Day on the N64. Even with all these classics, I will definitely say Pikmin 1 takes the cake. I effing adore Pikmin, and there's something about the first one that's just so cool to me. It has a strict time limit in comparison to 2 and 3, and while that could be seen as a downside, I don't know, it makes the game a little more interesting. Overall, I'd say Pikmin 3 is my favorite in the series, which is weird because I didn't even mention that game for my 2013 Game of the Year, but Pikmin 1 is just so much fun to pop in and replay. It's so easy to just plow through quickly, and I really love games like that, so I'd say it's my favorite game of 2001. Yeah, Melee is great and all, but I already claimed 3 Smash Bros. Games to be my Game of the Year. Let's mix some things up. Plus, I'm probably more likely to replay Pikmin 1 in comparison to Melee. Right now, I'd rather play Smash Bros. Ultimate. Even when Halo 1 screens Game of the Year on its packaging, we're going with a personal favorite of mine. Well, that was the quickest 6 hours I've ever experienced. It felt like 22 minutes or something, and it looks like it's finally time to reveal the winner! And the winner for Year of the Year 2018 is 2018. What the f? Hey y'all, Scott here. I think I've reached a critical point in my life recently. I feel like I have to actually get up and do something rather than just piss around talking about the Game Boy Color or whatever. So, this is it. I need to decide. Do I get up and contribute to society, or do I talk about the Game Boy Color? Yes, finally, I can experience the Game Boy in color. The Game Boy line of systems, honestly the brand most synonymous with portable on-the-go gaming. Oh man, what am I gonna do on this road trip? Throw a couple Game Boys in the back, you'll be fine. This is the original Game Boy released in 1989. It obviously released that year, there was no way you could miss it. Obviously it was produced with performance and cost effectiveness in mind. An ass green screen with no color, just varying shades of this is disgusting. But it lasted forever on 4AA batteries and was at a decent price point comparative to the other handheld competitors at the time. The Sega Game Gear and Atari Lynx had full color displays and they were lit up as well. You could actually see them. Who could possibly fathom winning this in comparison to these? Well, Nintendo had an ace up their sleeve. You see, the Game Boy had Tetris, Mario, Zelda, Tetris, Donkey Kong Tetris, Golf, Tetris, it had Tetris. Basically, you bought this to play video games, you bought these if you had insecurities. The original Game Boy completely solidified Nintendo's reign on the handheld market, and nobody could really top them. They had a solid price point, battery life, and the best game library you could ask for. Did you really want to get caught playing Sonic Triple Trouble? While the Game Boy was a massive success, it obviously warranted a successor, or at the very least, an upgrade. You really think Nintendo looked at this and said, yeah, that's good? They did. It took them 7 years to admit this may not stand the test of time. 1996, we got a redesign, the Game Boy Pocket. More compact, a much clearer screen, but it still wasn't lit or anything. You still needed to bring a lighter if you wanted to play at night. Well, 2 years later, in 1998, Nintendo released another revision of the Game Boy, the Game Boy Light. Like they started to give a decade in? The Game Boy Light was fundamentally the Game Boy Pocket, but not with a screen you could actually use in the dark. It was only released in Japan. Nintendo knows what we like over here. 2 revisions, still no true successor to the handheld. All the Game Boy games coming out were still designed for the brick of '89. By '98, this thing was screaming, I'm 9 years old, please let me die. It's truly surprising Nintendo was able to make the Game Boy last that long with no true successor in sight. I mean, sure, they released the Virtual Boy in 1995. They sure did. Okay, that was a concept for a product that never should have left the research and development department. Nintendo delayed the Nintendo 64 and needed to release something, which oddly enough was the working title for this. This wasn't a successor to the Game Boy. In what realm was this a handheld? But by 1998, things needed to change. The fact was, the Game Boy experienced a resurgence in popularity due to the release of Pokemon. Game developers were getting antsy. They wanted more power. They didn't want to be restricted to hardware from the 80s. But for a true giant leap in technology, Nintendo needed to wait a few more years. They were in fact working on a true successor to the Game Boy, but it wouldn't be until 2001 for it to release. To satiate everybody in the meantime, the Game Boy Color came out. The same year as the Game Boy Light. What was the goal there? This is the Game Boy Color. It's the Nintendo console that won the attendance award in high school. It happened, it did well, that's all there is to this one. What was its core innovation? The fact it could display something handheld game systems were displaying for decades? Yeah, big whoop, holy that's purple! The Game Boy Color is an odd duck, so many consider it to be a true successor to the original Game Boy. I'm one of those swine. But others consider it to be an upgraded Game Boy and nothing more. Something along the lines of the PS4 Pro to the PS4, the DSi to the DS, the new 3DS to the 3DS. Obviously, these were superior pieces of hardware to their predecessors, but they weren't generational leaps in quality. They were fundamentally better running systems to play the same games on. They may have had a handful of exclusive games, but fundamentally, they were still that same old system nobody wanted anymore. I think Nintendo themselves have this mentality with the Color, because usually whenever they spoke about how many units the Game Boy or Game Boy Color sold in their lifetimes, they would usually group them together. Here's my problem with that. Yes, these console upgrades sometimes have their own exclusive games that can only play on them specifically, but they're usually few and far between. I can count on 5 body parts how many Nintendo DSi exclusive games were released to stores. The Game Boy Color had hundreds of games that only worked on the Game Boy Color, definitely more than a lot of other systems that were considered their own thing, so I don't care. The Game Boy Color, to me, will always be the first true successor to the original handheld. It's its own system. If I defend a game system this much, do you think it'll notice?
What's the recipe for surprising the kids, treating yourself, and ditching dish duty? You're looking at it. Order your Pizza Hut faves like original pan, original stuffed crust, and more at pizzahut.com. No one out-pizzas the Hut.
Wait a minute. Pizza Hut stuffed crust is the crust that made crust good. Topped and stuffed with over a half-pound of cheese. What are you so afraid of? Loving it? Original stuffed crust, just $12.99. Only from Pizza Hut. No one out-pizzas the Hut.
So what's the deal with this thing? Well, the Game Boy Color is fundamentally a souped-up Game Boy. It was released in the latter half of 1998 worldwide because in the background, Nintendo was working on a much more advanced handheld to be released later. This was released to keep the Game Boy relevant and stop it from feeling too outdated and obsolete. The design of this handheld is one of the most iconic relics from the 90s, which is crazy considering it's so damn similar to previous models. Everything's laid out in the same way, it's nearly identical to previous designs, but I don't know how they did it. They made the Game Boy Color have its own unique look. You can immediately look at this and tell it's a Game Boy Color and not an original Game Boy. The shape is slightly tweaked, proportions are a bit different, it's the same general design, but updated in great ways that not only make it a better system, but add to its own character and charm. It does feel a bit more kiddie now though. See, the original Game Boy, this looks like a tool. This looks more like a toy, especially with the logo. Well, in terms of new features, the Color has no feature. No more contrast dial. Oh my god, that was my favorite part of the original Game Boy. It gave all games hard mode. This was always there because the screens were never gray and you'd have to adjust them based on your lighting conditions. Here on the Color, they were so confident with this screen, they removed it entirely. And this is a much better screen, but it's still not lit up. Strange considering the Game Boy Light released before this and the big fancy new one went back to a non-lit display. Nintendo's fire code must have been strict. Now, obviously it wasn't included to keep costs down, but under normal lighting conditions, it looks fine, it's just not ideal. We only need 2 AA's to power this bad boy, or you can plug it into the wall with an AC adapter. I've never seen somebody do this with an old school Game Boy. There's an IR blaster on the top, basically the same thing used on most TV remotes. It's not used in a ton of games, but when it was used, it was mainly just a way to transfer stuff like high scores to other players. Thank God the screen wasn't lit for us to get this. The buttons all have a comfortable, slightly rubbery feel to them, and I like that. They are all slightly smaller than I may prefer, but hey, at the time this was the definitive Game Boy if you hated seeing things. So to quote any parent who picks this up, what the is this? The Game Boy Color works as a regular old Game Boy. You can play all your old cartridges, with some of them having added color to them. Most of the time the color added is literally just, well, now the game's not completely colorless. There's faint color added here and there, but it's not enough to really say, oh wow, all my Game Boy games are in color now. They just use different color palettes in these games. They never programmed Wheel of Fortune to have color, so the Game Boy Color adds a faint dab of it here and there in very smart ways, so it doesn't look out of place or anything. It's still pretty much black and white, but what once were varying shades of gray on the original model are now varying shades of certain other colors. You can actually change the color palettes on the old Game Boy games with different color combinations on the startup screen. Like I said, a nice little bonus, though it's not full color and it's not like it changes any of these games. But hey, have you ever wondered what color the sky was in Mario Land? God, you need this thing right now. Speaking of Mario Land, a few select original Game Boy games had specific colors programmed for them, so if you'd play them on the Super Game Boy adapter for the Super Nintendo or later on the Game Boy Color, they'd be more colorized than other Game Boy games, though not like that much more. But that's just the original Game Boy games. The Game Boy Color also plays special Game Boy games that take advantage of the new hardware. The Game Boy Color enhanced games are just standard Game Boy cartridges with a splash of color on them, normally black. These play perfectly fine on both systems, but if you have a sense of self-worth, you play them on the Game Boy Color to see everything in Crayola flavors. Basically, these are Game Boy Color games that also run on the original Game Boy. But then we have the games that are apparently too good to be seen on the original Game Boy models. These have distinct Game Boy Color logos on the cartridges, are translucent, and have convex tops. Easiest way to put it, the original Game Boy cartridges you could use as pill organizers. Game Boy Color, not so much. These games take advantage not only of the color, but the upgraded hardware as well. But here's what I find really bizarre. Nintendo went to all the trouble to ensure by looking at the game cartridges, you could tell what played on the original Game Boy and what couldn't. But the original cardboard boxes these games came in, they only said Game Boy Color on the front. Even if it played on the original Game Boy, you'd have to turn it around to see if it could play on the original. Now, the exclusive games generally had only for Game Boy Color on the box, but the fact that I just realized that, like right now, I am shocked there wasn't nearly as much confusion when these games came out. I mean, a lot of these Game Boy Color games that said Game Boy Color on the box played on the original Game Boy no problem. Now, if you tried to play Game Boy Color only games on the original Game Boy, you'd get unique screens telling you to piss out. I always liked that many of these games didn't just display generic error messages. Just seeing a logo or special design is a cool little detail. But whatever, what matters is the games on the Game Boy Color and what released on it. So what released on it? Well, here in North America, we got 4 titles that launched alongside the system, and it was just a bunch of old Tetris DX, so this is Tetris again. We have full color and some very basic different modes to play in, but it doesn't feel really all too distinct from the original Game Boy Tetris, and it lacks the iconic Tetris theme. Alright, this is going in the pile. Game & Watch Gallery 2! So, the Game & Watch Gallery games were compilations of the old school LCD Game & Watch units Nintendo would make. They're all very simple games, and Gallery took those titles and remade them with Mario characters and some new twists, while also incorporating the original versions as well. I couldn't have thought of anything better to launch with this brand new high-tech Game Boy. Game & Watch games. Centipede, yeah, that was a graphical showcase. And Pocket Bomberman, which in all fairness is a cool Bomberman title. It's actually more of a side-scrolling platformer compared to the traditional overhead Bomberman games. Yep, can't think of better games to launch a system with. These all worked on the original Game Boy. The Game Boy Color has a weird library, and I think the launch titles are indicative of that. I know I said how I consider it to be its own system, but so many of the titles that are labeled as Game Boy Color games are just Game Boy games that display in color when you pop them in the system. But there were still tons of games that were exclusive to the Game Boy Color that took advantage of the better hardware. But it just so happened around the time the Color released, Nintendo got really weird with what they considered publishing worthy. I would scream if they ever decided to publish a game called Little Mermaid 2 Pinball Frenzy. Nintendo's output was incredibly strange on this thing. If I had to guess why, I'd say it's because they didn't want to fully commit to dropping the original Game Boy in favor of the Game Boy Color, so they kept at it with these cross-compatible releases for a while, and by the time they really started to put out color-exclusive titles, the Game Boy Advance was right around the corner. This thing was the new kid in town for only 3 years, so Nintendo really didn't pour a ton of support into it. Because of this, we got a lot of re-releases, reimaginings, and games that were companion titles to N64 games. Let this sink in. One of the defining Game Boy Color games was a re-release of an original Game Boy game, The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening DX. It was Link's Awakening in color. Yep. I get a little miffed when they decide to re-release games on platforms that could already play those games. You could already play Link's Awakening on the Game Boy Color with just the Game Boy cartridge. Why not remake Zelda 1 or 2 for the handheld? To be fair, they did add a few things, like a brand new optional dungeon to explore that focused on color-based puzzles, and with DX actually getting the full color treatment, it really made this the definitive version at the time. This is a fantastic game. It was just an old one. Of course, this re-release worked on the original Game Boy as well, good for it, but what about something that could have only run on the Game Boy Color? Well, lucky for us, Nintendo put out the original Donkey Kong Country on the system. Holy this is raw. I mean, at the time, this was a pretty faithful interpretation of the original SNES game. It was always amazing seeing what once was a home console game run on a handheld. And Donkey Kong Country on Game Boy Color, it's obviously downgraded and not the ideal way to play, but they did it alright. I mean, the original Game Boy had the Donkey Kong Land games, and the Game Boy Color version of Country was definitely a step up from those. This is a neat little novelty, but not much more than that nowadays. What about Super Mario Bros. Deluxe? This was the original NES game, but with so many new features and bells and whistles, you could go backwards in this one. They added an overworld map, a save feature, more modes like You vs. Boo, where you race a Boo to the end of the level. The original Super Mario Bros. 2 can be unlocked. We have a calendar? This is an incredible version of Super Mario Bros. The one issue is that the screen is so zoomed in, it can be a nightmare to play. Yeah, because the aspect ratio of the Game Boy Color was so skinny and the screen itself was so tiny, everything is crunched onto the screen, and because of that, it does require a bit of getting used to. Back in the day, this was the best option to play Mario 1 on the go, but now when I play this, I just think, my god, it doesn't have to be this way. Mario Tennis and Mario Golf released on the Nintendo 64, so in tandem with that, they made some Game Boy Color versions. These are completely different. While the console versions were basically sports party games, these are full-blown RPGs. You play as children, and your goal is to try to beat Mario at sports. IGN gave Golf a 10 out of 10. I'm definitely more of a golf guy, but these are both still solid titles. But what about the wackier, more experimental side of Nintendo? Well, there was Kirby Tilt and Tumble, a motion control game with a tumor/accelerometer. You tilt the Game Boy around to move Kirby. It was incredibly novel and still works best on the original Game Boy Color. It was designed for this hardware-specific build, but you can play it on the Game Boy Player on the GameCube if you're a masochist. Wario Land 2 and 3 were on here, with 2 being released for the Game Boy and then being released for the Game Boy Color later. The Game Boy Color released still worked on the original Game Boy. Why is this so confusing to me? Wario Land 3 was a full-on Game Boy Color exclusive though. I don't know much about the meat of Wario Land. I'm more of a bread guy. Basically, I've played 1 and 4. But Nintendo's crowning achievements on the Game Boy Color are obviously The Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Seasons, and Oracle of Ages. Original Zelda titles. These are very much cut from the same cloth as Link's Awakening. They look very similar, but these were developed by Capcom, and they went for the Pokemon approach of selling 2 games that were kinda sorta the same. The Oracle games are more so 2 chapters of one story, where you can play them in either order. Whatever one you finish, you get a code to enter in the other game, and you see how they connect. It's a brilliant idea that was only done this one time for Zelda. But of course, if we're talking games that had a dual release that were kinda sorta the same but not really, yeah sure, Pokemon. Pokemon Yellow was sorta kind of a Game Boy Color game. It had some color enhancements thrown in there, but the core of the game was still a classic Game Boy title. Pokemon Gold and Silver were made from the ground up for the Game Boy Color. They worked on the original Game Boy. Are you kidding me? Well, the enhanced version of Gold and Silver Crystal released as a Game Boy Color exclusive. Look at that cartridge shape. It can't be anything but a Game Boy Color exclusive. Where the was the only for Game Boy Color logo on the box? How is nobody confused? The Game Boy Color was definitely where more and more Pokemon spin-offs were starting to show their head. The trading card game, pinball, puzzle challenge, they were definitely up to do weirder stuff back then. Speaking of which, Nintendo didn't do a ton of huge first-party stuff on this machine, but they published damn near anything they could. Quest for Camelot? Go for it. Bugs Bunny's Crazy Castle 3? Why not? Beauty and the Beast, a board game adventure? It. Hamtaro, Ham Hams Unite? I've heard worse. Little Mermaid 2, Pinball Frenzy? What may be even weirder is Nintendo's internal American development studio, Nintendo Software Technology, developed the games Bionic Commando Elite Forces and Crystalis, with Nintendo as a whole publishing them. These were Capcom and SNK properties that Nintendo just decided to develop and publish on the Game Boy Color. Like I said, their output was weird on this thing. And not only that, but we got games that nobody ever expected on this handheld. Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil Gaiden, Tomb Raider, Driver, GTA 2, and many of these actually played fairly well. There were tons of cool games developers tried to bring over to the Game Boy Color, and shockingly, many of them worked out fairly well. Not only that, but series like Dragon Quest and Mega Man came over gracefully, and new ones like Tokitori and Shantae started out here. It's still a weird handheld. I may have been wrong about this thing. This system isn't nearly as in-depth as I thought it was. A lot of the games that were labeled as Game Boy Color titles were just Game Boy games with colors programmed into them. Even Nintendo support on this thing was really weird and lackluster. We got a few original Zeldas, some ports and remakes, Mario sports titles, and enhanced Pokemon. That's basically it. But still, original Zeldas and a Pokemon. Those are huge games for Nintendo to just put them on a simple upgraded Game Boy if it was only a simple upgraded Game Boy. What the was this thing? An excuse for me to waste 17 minutes.
E is the only place Hollywood icons would send their kids to work.
Dude, are you kidding me?
This January,
Today, breeding season.
Nope, I will not be doing that.
8 celebrity kids,
These are the shoes I was telling you about, the Prada ones. They're perfect for the ranch, right?
famous parents,
My dad is Shaquille O'Neal.
Your dad is like worldwide.
0 life skills.
I don't touch sheep. I don't ride horses.
Oh my God, what are you doing?
Giddy up for relatively famous ranch rules. New series, January 12th, only on E.
Hey y'all, Scott here. Are your games too balanced? Do you suffer from not being a dirtbag enough? Want to commit video game adultery? Well, might I recommend cheat codes? Before I use cheat codes, I look like this. And look at me now. Cheat codes, what separated the men from the scumbags! They were a way of life for a while. After playing a game for a bit, what better way to get more out of it than to enter in some sweet, sweet button inputs on a random menu to see some crazy stuff. A cheat code can be anything that's generally a secret command you enter in a game to change something up, and it seemed that almost every game had them for a while. Cheat codes were on the rise and were at their peak in the 5th and 6th generation of consoles, until absolutely plummeting into obscurity during the 7th. I assume cheat codes aren't as much of a thing these days due to video games being taken more seriously with stuff like online leaderboards and esports. Cheating is just more frowned upon now. Like, you cheat in Mario Tennis 64, you're the playground's messiah. You You cheat in Mario Tennis Aces, the neighbors get alerted when you move in near them. Personally though, I didn't really use cheat codes to specifically cheat at games. I used them to just have fun. Rarely did I ever use them to get past a tough level or something. I was always into the weird and wacky cheat codes, stuff that changed physics, altered your appearance, or gave you a bunch of upgrades just to mess around for an afternoon. Now, potentially the first cheat code ever was in Manic Miner on the ZX Spectrum in 1983. Typing 6031769 while playing allowed you to go to any cavern in the game. But let's be real here. This doesn't hold a candle to this. The Konami code, the most well-known cheat code in existence. You rattle off an up, up, down, down, left, right, BA start in a handful of Konami games and you come face to face with a variety of different outcomes. Of course, the most famous thing the Konami code did was give the player 30 lives in Contra, but it also did the same thing in Life Force, gave you most of the power-ups in Gradius, and unlocked all the songs in Beat Mania for the Game Boy Color. Yeah! The NES era of cheat codes primarily consisted of giving you more lives or continues. For example, Super Mario Bros. Had a secret continue code. When you lose all your lives, you hold A, B, and push start to at least continue at the beginning of the world you died in. However, some codes definitely stood out more than others. Sometimes it could be nothing more than hold A, bird fans, and other times, they could be really cool secrets. Easy example would be the Justin Bailey code in Metroid. Entering that in the password screen allowed you to play as Samus without her power suit and sporting green hair. A game with a password screen was almost guaranteed to have cheats. It's just the perfect opportunity to throw some in there. With that said, passwords were ways to allow you to resume your progress in games without save functions. So technically, just entering a password for a level you haven't gotten to yet can be considered a cheat code. Want to skip everything in Mega Man 2? Well, here you go! Throwing it out there, I was playing SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom on my Game Boy Advance on the school bus, as everybody born in 1997 did. I entered a bunch of random junk on the password screen, and bam, I unknowingly entered the code for the final boss, and I will be perfectly honest, that was probably my proudest gaming moment. Now, after the NES era, cheat codes started to get really fun. Another famous one was definitely the Blood Code in Mortal Kombat on the Sega Genesis. The SNES version was a wimp. It was censored and sweaty. The Genesis version was the real deal, and even though it technically looked worse, everybody flocked to it for one lone reason. Entering this code enabled the blood, and that's what Mortal Kombat is all about. Sonic the Hedgehog's had a great history with cheats, specifically the level select codes, allowing you to access any level you want right from the get-go on the title screen. But what's really special is the debug mode. This is hell. GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64 was famous for being a pioneer in two mediums, first-person console shooters and big head mode cheat codes. Come on, you can't beat this. This is wonderful. It was in a fair amount of games, including NBA Jam as well. The Tony Hawk's Pro Skater series had loads of codes, even offering a menu specifically for cheat codes. Man, nothing can ever live up to Moon Gravity. Look at this! But in this day and age where cheat codes have all but vanished, one company has been doing God's work and cramming them in almost every game they can. Rockstar continues to pop cheats in their games, most famously with the Grand Theft Auto series. Cheat codes allow me to play GTA in the only way I could ever imagine playing GTA, with no giving intact. The one I remember using cheat codes on the most was San Andreas. Now, I mainly played this one on a computer, and not just any computer, a Mac, which means... But the fun thing about that version of San Andreas was that the codes had to be typed into the keyboard, meaning a lot of them were pretty easy to remember because they were just phrases. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang made the cars fly, while you could also have some super hops and have gluttony reign supreme. But one of my favorite cheats to enable in Grand Theft Auto would always be entering a code for an insane arsenal of weapons, nabbing a hefty wanted level, and just seeing how long I could survive. This is what Grand Theft Auto always ends up being whenever I play it. Now, I mainly remember nabbing cheat codes from magazines, specifically the Tips and Tricks code books. I never subscribed to these, but I would pick them up sometimes at the drugstore. This one always made me feel really anxious, like Bowser and ass together? My hand would always cover this portion just in case I would get diagnosed with adult supervision. Tips and Tricks code book for Sonic's 15th anniversary. This was the one I thumbed through the most as a kid. It has a huge section on all previous Sonic games up until that point and has just about any and all games you could possibly want codes for covered as well. The cheat code paperback book market was at the top of its game back then. I mean, come on, name a better way to find out that you can change the bowling ball color in Wii Sports. The origins of cheat code books can be traced back to Nintendo Power, which had its own various tips and cheats you could read up on, which later brought life to strategy guides and books dedicated to cheats for all you top players out there. Anybody else find it weird that cheat code reading material was almost always marketed for supreme video game players when cheats are used to make games, you know, easier? But sometimes, cheat codes created by the game developers just aren't enough, and you want to delve into the immoral side of gaming. Cheat devices. Various products have been released over the years that alter game code to let you do all kinds of things God forbid Nintendo see. Infinite lives, crazy physics, anything's game here. There are loads of cheat devices that have appeared over the course of time, like Game Shark and Codebreaker, but these are the two I have, the original Game Genie on NES and an Action Replay for the GameCube. Game Genie is definitely one of the most well-known cheat devices, and one of the first of its kind as well. Being an unlicensed accessory for the NES that let you make Mario jump higher than Nintendo wanted him to, Nintendo hated it. Nintendo sued Galoob, the makers of the game Genie, citing copyright infringement. This was still the early 90s, so everybody ranging from the US government to the people who actually made video games still were having a hard time figuring out how copyright works with the medium. Since the Game Genie modified game code to do some wild stuff, Nintendo made the argument that their code is copyrighted and couldn't be tampered with. But the thing was, Galoob wasn't modifying Clu Clu Land and selling their own version of it. The Game Genie was something the consumer bought after already purchasing an NES game. It's like if you took a book and changed all the periods to commas. I mean, yeah, you're a lunatic, but it's your book, do whatever you want. Nintendo tried their hardest, but in the end they lost the case and the Game Genie lived on. There was a version for the Super Nintendo and Game Boy, and the Genesis and Game Gear versions were licensed by Sega themselves, a bit of a jab at Nintendo since they despised the Game Genie. After actually playing with this thing, it can be a bit finicky, but it's an absolute blast. Look at this, I'm cheating! The Game Genie came with a code book that covered a handful of popular NES games and codes to pop into them. You just insert the game into the Game Genie and then insert the Game Genie into the console. Easy stuff. You then have to enter some codes, you can enter multiple codes or just one. Many of them are totally lame, like infinite lives, whatever, who cares? You can start Super Mario Bros. 3 with the frog suit. I've had nightmares about this before, it's great to finally face my fears. However, the device is useful if you want games to be a bit easier potentially, like the Zelda code makes you invincible, and this River City Ransom one boosts all your stats from the get-go. But I'm a simple man, give me a code that makes my jump weird and I'm all on board. This is amazing. The Action Replay is a similar line of cheat devices that actually got its start all the way back on the Commodore 64. However, unlike the Game Genie, Action Replay just kept on coming out for seemingly every platform for a while. Game Genie was a lot more wholesome, you just look through the codebook and have fun. Action Replay is way more hacky feeling. The versions for different systems vary, however many can allow you to not only mess with game code and cheat, but play import games, some homebrew stuff, and use save states. This is a version I have for the GameCube, and yeah, it does have codes for Cars the video game. I was wondering when you'd ask. For some reason, they put the disc in the same packaging you'd see for batteries, but whatever. We pop the disc in and bam, I'm overwhelmed. In some respects, Action Replay is more user-friendly than the Game Genie due to having all the codes built in. You just select what cheats you want, push start, swap out the Action Replay disc for the game you want, and there we go. If you guys needed proof I was good at Sonic Heroes, here, max rings and points 1 second into playing. Here we go, Super Mario Sunshine with cheats! Here we go, Super Mario Sunshine with cheats! This is terrifying. I'm crazy fast, I can jump and do this. Double dash, we have infinite stars, this is boring. Pac-Man World 2. Moving on. Action Replay is one of the few ways to obtain the rarer NES games in Animal Crossing and totally allows me to grab all trophies in Melee with ease. Gotta be honest, I never owned any cheat devices as a kid. I played Donkey Konga how Nintendo wanted me to, damn it! But these are pretty fun. I know a lot of other people use cheat devices on their DS for stuff like Pokemon, but me? I personally stuck to cheat codes baked into the game. There was just something magical about successfully inputting a code and experiencing the game in a way you've never seen before. They're just straight up fun, and it really bums me out that they're rarely seen in games anymore. I guess companies just thought, oh yeah, we can charge for cheats, and just threw stuff like alternate costumes on online stores. And in terms of cheats that give you infinite lives or whatever, I think developers just find it much more useful to make an accessible easy mode, which I actually kind of agree with. However, I still love cheats, and no matter what, their legacy will always live on. At least we'll always have the memories of cheat codes and the old games to still use them on, which is great, seriously. How else am I supposed to beat Wheel of Fortune on NES? Can't beat this sucker without the moon gravity cheat.